When they blasted the last piece of the Glines Canyon Dam on the Elwha River, the salmon came flooding back. The Coho came back. The Steelhead came back, some of them summoned home from the ocean by trout that had been landlocked for 100 years. The bull trout doubled. 8 kinds of sea-run fish flooded into a river that had been sealed off since before your great-grandparents were born. Everything came back, except the one that mattered most. This is the story of a single fish, the Chinook, the king salmon, the largest, the most prized, the one the tribes built their culture around, the fish that southern resident killer whales depend on to survive, and the one the whole restoration was supposed to save. And more than a decade after America tore down 2 dams to bring it home, the king is still missing. That matters right now, in 2026, more than it ever has. Because 400 miles to the south, on the Klamath River, the largest dam removal in history just finished, and the salmon are pouring back exactly the way everyone hoped. The celebration is real, the headlines are euphoric, the fish are everywhere. We've seen this before, and we know how the first chapter ends, because another river already lived it. Its name is the Elwha in the mountains of Washington state. In 2014, it became the biggest dam removal the world had ever seen. The test case, the proof of concept, the river everyone points to when they say tearing down dams works. And it did work, mostly, spectacularly in places. But the Elwha is also the river that learned the hardest lesson in modern conservation. That bringing a species back to a river is not the same as bringing it back. That a fish can return and still not recover. If you want to know what the Klamath will look like in 10 years, you don't need to guess. You just have to look north. To understand the warning, you have to understand the triumph, because the Elwha genuinely was won. The river falls out of the Olympic Mountains in Washington state, and for most of the 20th century, 2 dams choked it. The Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam were built in the early 1900s, without any way for fish to get past them, which was illegal even then. For over 100 years, salmon that had once run up more than 70 miles of river were slammed into a concrete wall a few miles from the sea. A river that once produced legendary runs, including Chinook said to reach 100 pounds, was cut down to a fraction of itself. The people who never accepted this were the lower Elwha Klamath tribe, whose entire way of life was built on those salmon, and whose treaty right to fish them was guaranteed on paper and denied in reality. Their 1855 Treaty of Point No Point guaranteed them the right to fish these waters, and a century of dams made that right meaningless. They fought for decades, and in 2014, after 20 years of planning, the last piece of the Glines Canyon Dam was blasted away. It was, at the time, the largest dam removal project the world had ever seen. What happened next was breathtaking. 10.5 million tons of sediment, a century of trapped sand and gravel, flushed downstream in a process scientists call sediment transport, rebuilding the river's beaches and estuary almost overnight. And the fish did not wait for permission. Within days, bull trout were spotted above the old dam site. Then Chinook, then Coho, then Steelhead. Within about 2.5 years, 8 different sea-run species had pushed back into water they'd been locked out of for a century. Some recovered fast. Coho came back strong enough that the tribe could hold its first small ceremonial harvest in a generation. Steelhead exploded, including a genetic miracle, where rainbow trout that had been trapped and landlocked for 100 years suddenly remembered how to go to sea, swam to the ocean, and came back as full steelhead. Bull trout more than doubled. For a few years, it looked like a clean, total victory, and that is exactly the trap. Here's the lesson the Elwha taught, the one almost nobody wants to put in a headline. A fish returning to a river is not the same as a fish recovering in it. Getting a salmon to swim past where a dam used to be, that's the fast part. That happens in months. What comes after is the slow part. The fish has to dig its red and spawn successfully, and its offspring, the tiny parr and the smolts heading to sea for the first time, have to survive, and their offspring after that, generation after generation, until there are finally enough of them to call a population healed. And that timeline isn't measured in years. It's measured in decades. Nowhere is that clearer than with the king. More than 10 years after the Elwha's dams came down, Chinook salmon, the single species the entire project was built to save, are still struggling. They're in the river. They're spawning in stretches they hadn't reached in a century, but their numbers remain low and fragile, nowhere near the historic runs, and their comeback has been slower and shakier than almost everything else in the watershed. Why the king, specifically? Partly because Chinook are simply harder. They're the biggest, they need the most, and they were already an endangered, hatchery-dependent population before the dams even fell. And partly because a century behind concrete doesn't erase in a decade. The habitat is open, but a wild, self-sustaining king salmon run has to be rebuilt slowly from a battered starting point. In a warming world with rising water temperatures that press against the thermal limits salmon can survive. The federal scientists tracking the river are honest about it. Dam removal is working, they say. The river is healthier, the fish are spreading, the trajectory is right. But full recovery of Chinook, they warn plainly, will take decades. The Elwha didn't fail. It just proved that success on a river this size is a marathon, and at 10 years in, you're barely off the starting line. Now hold that thought and go south, because right now, on the Klamath River, the first chapter is being written all over again, and it reads exactly like the Elwha's did. The Klamath runs through southern Oregon and northern California, and for a century, 4 dams strangled it. The tribes of that basin, the Yurok, the Karuk, the Hoopa Valley, the Klamath tribes, fought the same long fight the Klallam did, backed by the same hard-won treaty fishing rights that courts have enforced since the Bolt decision in 1974, and they won bigger. In 2024, the last of the 4 dams, Iron Gate Dam, owned by the energy company PacifiCorp, was pulled out entirely. It became the largest dam removal in United States history, reopening more than 400 miles of river, nearly 6 times what the Elwha opened. And the salmon responded like they'd been waiting. Within weeks of Iron Gate coming down, fall Chinook were spawning above the old dam sites, digging their redds in gravel that had been buried under a reservoir for decades, for the first time since 1961. By the fall of 2025, they'd pushed all the way up to the Link River and into Upper Klamath Lake. Water no salmon had touched in over a century. The early numbers are genuinely strong. More than 11,000 adult Chinook counted above the former Iron Gate site, and the count of young jack salmon, a preview of next year's run, jumped to over 18,000, more than double the year before. The river itself is healing just as fast. With the reservoirs gone, the water runs cooler when the fish need it cool. Water temperatures that once spiked high enough to kill salmon outright are already dropping. The toxic algae blooms that used to choke the river have shrunk, and a parasite that once killed huge numbers of juvenile salmon is far less common. When those smolts head to sea, they're leaving a healthier river than any Klamath salmon has known in living memory. Scientists describe salmon reoccupying, in their words, just about every corner of their historic habitat. It is, by every early measure, a spectacular start. But you've read this chapter before. This is the Elwha in 2015. The euphoria, the flood of returning fish, the sense of total victory. And if the Elwha is any guide, the hardest part of the Klamath story hasn't started yet. So what does the crystal ball actually show? It shows that the celebration on the Klamath is real and earned and not a lie. The river will heal. Most of the fish will come back. The water is already better. None of that is in doubt, and the Elwha proves it. But it also shows the part the headlines will skip, that somewhere around year 5 or year 10, the easy wins will level off, and the story will get quieter and harder. The Coho and the Steelhead will likely lead. And the Chinook, the king, the fish the tribes are really fighting for, the one that carries the most weight both on a dinner table and in a ceremony, the one the southern resident killer whales are waiting for too, will probably be the last to come home, and the one whose recovery is measured not in seasons but in generations. There's a fair caveat, and it cuts both ways. The Klamath isn't the Elwha. It's far bigger, warmer, and drier, wrapped in farmland and water disputes the Elwha never had, which could make its Chinook recovery even harder. But it also opened vastly more habitat, and its fish have somewhere enormous to spread. The Elwha is a guide. It is not a guarantee. What it guarantees is only this: patience. The dam coming down is not the finish line. It's the starting gun, which brings us back to the king. More than a decade after the Elwha ran free, its Chinook still aren't home. Not really, not the way they were before the concrete. And that's not the failure of dam removal. It's the measure of how deep the damage went and how long real repair actually takes. A river can be reopened in an afternoon. A 100-pound king salmon run, torn out over a century, comes back the way it left, slowly and against the odds. But it is coming back. That's the part worth holding on to. On the Elwha, wild fish are spawning above dams that stood for 100 years. On the Klamath, salmon are swimming through a lake their ancestors last saw before anyone alive was born. The rivers remember what they're supposed to be. The fish remember where to go. The kings will be the last to return. They always are. And when they finally do, years from now, on a river, most people have already stopped watching. That will be the moment the story was really about. Not the day the dams came down, the day the king came home.